Welcome to another episode of Mission Compliance, Unleashing Growth Potential for Defense Contractors. In today's episode, we're diving into a crucial yet often overlooked component of your compliance strategy, role-based access control, or RBAC. Think of it as your cybersecurity bouncer, ensuring the right people have the right access. Nothing more, nothing less. From keeping sensitive data secure to acing your audits, RBAC is more than a best practice. It's your golden ticket to streamline compliance. Stick around as we unpack how to implement RBAC effectively and why it's essential for meeting today's stringent compliance standards. Ice, ice, baby. We're joined once again today by Mike Frieder, President of On-Call Compliance Solutions and a CMMC Professional Assessor. Thanks for joining us, Mike.
Hey, always a pleasure, Roman.
So, Mike, today we're talking about role-based access control and its importance in the compliance process. And we actually came to this topic because you filmed a video for YouTube about it, which by the time this episode comes out may be out on YouTube. So go check it out. But with that being said, what exactly is role-based access control, and how does it differ from other access management strategies?
Yeah, so RBAC or role-based access control is a methodology of controlling access where what you have access to and what functions you can perform are based on the role that you have been given either within your company or specifically the role within the information system, which a lot of people don't know. RBAC should tie your role in the company, right? What your job is or what your currently assigned job duties are, it should be tying that into your role in the company. And then, of course, that translates down to permissions and access control and what your account can do on these systems. And it's interesting because role-based access control, if you're looking for a setting, there's no setting, right? There's no setting called role-based access control. RBAC is a methodology or really it's a security model that assigns access permissions to users based on their roles within an organization. And what it's really acting to do is it ensures that individuals can access only the resources and information necessary for their currently assigned job functions. Um, this ties in with NIST a lot because it enforces the principle of least privilege and it improves security and operational efficiency. So, the RBAC, as you think about it, you could probably kind of just lump that right in there with Microsoft's Active Directory or Entra ID or whatever in the world they want to call it these days. And I think that's where I think a lot of people just really get confused. They're thinking like, oh, I got to go find some RBAC settings, or I've got to go implement RBAC. There's nothing to implement, right? It's a security model. And where it should be implemented, if anywhere, is you should have documentation that calls out that you're using the role-based access control methodology or security model. That's it's so many misunderstandings about this whole thing. And the way you're demonstrating is you're taking people through Active Directory, you're taking people through group policy is another place where you can really show where the machine behavior or the user behavior is dictated, all of which can tie back to a role because you can enforce a group policy back to a role or security group. So yeah, there's so much to unpack on this topic, but the reality is for NIST, to be implemented successfully, you've got to have some form of a security model. And so, that's really, RBAC, I think is the easiest, you know, I think it's the easiest model to implement because it lines up with exactly what Windows really does. You asked the question, what are some other kinds of security models? There's another model called ABAC or attribute-based access control. And it defines access based on attributes of the user, the resource, the environment, for rules and things like that, but they're attribute based instead of role based. I think for most defense contractors using a Windows based system, which most are, the role based works a lot better than an attribute based. There's also policy based access control where you just simply have strict access control policies. But I think that might be a little bit limiting given the complexity of most environments, even small environments. There's discretionary access control, there's mandatory access control, there's identity-based access controls. There's all kinds of stuff out there, but role-based access control, I think, is really the one where it's broad enough, there's enough complexity there, and it just generally allows you to, um, fulfill the needs that are all within NIST SP 800-171. So that's really why we recommend that.
Absolutely. So some of these questions may seem a little bit redundant or repetitive. So just feel free to double down or elaborate more fully if you've already touched on it, which I think some of these that you have, especially this next one, where is why is RBAC considered a critical element in meeting compliance requirements like CMMC and DFARS and NIST?
Yeah, it's interesting. And there are a lot of controls that, you use RBAC to answer, but a lot of it just simply boils down to the principle of least privilege, right? So we can really distill it down to NIST requires users to only be able to access exactly what they need to access to do their job and nothing more. Role-based access control is the most clear-cut yet robust enough security model for access control that I think you can really use. So in that regard, I think that's a huge bonus when it comes to role-based access control. Is just it fits the mold and it fits very well what NIST kind of calls for, if you will. And then again, Active Directory and Entra ID are basically kind of more or less based off of role-based access control. So the fact that Microsoft and Windows have sort of designed it to be this way really, really works well. Now, there are other systems, like let's say you're using multi-factor authentication, you could use a zero trust access control system, right? There's other systems that may be better for more simple systems, but in the case of NIST and just generally how most defense contractors have their network set up, RBAC is just kind of the logical conclusion there.
Can RBAC, or I think we know that it can, so how can RBAC enhance more than just compliance, such as operational efficiency or cybersecurity posture?
It's a great question. And I think that question is one that is really founded in the word scale. So RBAC can probably be the most scalable of the models. So in other words, you can set up a job role and let's call it a backup administrator. You can set up a backup administrator and put as many people in there as you want. And they all get the same permissions and the same roles and the same capabilities and the same functions and protocols and they can do the same. They are effectively a monitor, excuse me, a mirror image. That's super powerful. Super, super, super powerful. Is it powerful for small businesses? No, not really. I think for small businesses, they're going to configure a very basic Active Directory. But as the organization grows and gets more complex, the Active Directory grows substantially and um, it becomes larger and larger and larger. And that's really that's the crux of it is scalable. It is very easy to modify and manipulate. There are certainly more elements in RBAC than some of the other security models, but I think for, again, looking at a Windows-based network, even with Macs involved, so it's not just exclusive to Mac, but I mean like an Entra ID or an Active Directory style of directory service or permissioning or security system. Uh, that's really where I think it makes the most sense. The scalability is incredible. You can run a network with one user, you can run a network with 100,000 users. Doesn't really make a difference. You can keep on adding roles and access permissions based on those roles and security and group policy, and it just makes sense. It's interesting, I kind of make a joke about it because for years and years and years and years and years, there's this thing called Active Directory. And I think it's a great name. It describes what it is. It's an active directory of users and computers and resources within the system. When Microsoft continued to evolve Active Directory in the Azure and Azure government clouds, they have now switched to using the phrase Entra. And there must be a reason for it. I think it probably makes sense. But I think it's just kind of one of those situations where, Microsoft wants to show that they're evolving their product, um, to being more cloud focused, right? I mean, I think, Active Directory was primarily designed as an on-premise, um, sort of security model. Entra ID definitely has way expanded functionality and is, their attitude is they want it to be cloud first. So, I think that's probably a good portion of why they've switched names, but it is very confusing, especially if you've been around the industry for a long time like I have.
How do small businesses with limited resources approach RBAC without overcomplicating their IT infrastructure?
That's a challenge, right? That's a really great question. Um, First off, I think the great thing about the way that Microsoft has designed its identity and access management system, which is, Active Directory, Entra ID, with role-based access control, it is possible for it to be simple. You can just have an administrator user and a standard user, and that's it. Then you can start creating security groups and other types of users as you need to. But you really only need a standard user and an administrative user. So if you're trying to keep it simple, that's the way to keep it simple. You just simply make it a standard user and an administrative user.
All right, and we actually have another question. We actually have five questions. So,
Bring it on.
how often should organizations review and update their RBAC policies, and who should be involved in that process? This feels like a softball, so hit it out of the park.
Yeah, I mean, you start getting into another kind of security principle, which is change management. Um, So the answer is they should be looking at them on a daily basis, right? I mean, it's as the needs of the organization and the users in that organization evolve, that's when you've got to be looking at it and making changes. So that's one thing. I know that anytime we even think about making a change to a system, there's got to be a service ticket. It takes time to go make the change. It's got to be approved and authorized. All that, there's a lot to it. Those things are happening on a daily basis, and we're not that big of a company. We're a good, solid, medium-sized company. So ultimately, I think every day. And then I think the other thing is, we advocate for periodic risk management meetings. So during risk management meetings, there should be discussion about whether or not, your roles are set up correctly. Do you need to revise that? Is there anything else that needs to be done? So I think in those kinds of instances, it's necessary to review it on an ongoing basis, then a set periodic basis. I'd recommend quarterly. And yeah, I think that's really kind of how I would foresee that is it's got to just be both at guaranteed intervals, but also we all know that this stuff really gets dealt with on a daily basis, particularly when you experience growth or even maybe shrinkage, right? As the company shrinks, you've probably got to reduce the number of roles that you have in the organization, and thus reducing the amount of potential slots somebody could fit into to get permission to something that's too much.
And just for the sake of consistency on these podcast episodes, are there any additional challenges to implementing role-based access in your organization?
I think a lot of the challenge comes with smaller organizations. Smaller organizations are almost always going to outsource their IT. It's just how it works. It doesn't make sense for them to have a full-time six-figure IT person who knows the ins and outs of group policy and configuring Entra ID and all that fun stuff. So, I think that it's not the easiest thing to really implement on your own, especially if you're not a computer person. You can almost forget about it. You really need a pro to help you implement. So I think that's definitely a significant challenge. I mean, I think that's where on-call comes in play for a lot of our clients is we run these systems. We run them on an ongoing basis and really empower our clients to do what needs to be done. Um, you just simply need a decent amount of technical chops in order to be able to pull this off. And um, there's not really any two ways about this, right? It's just part of what has to be done. So I think that there's that element. Um, it's technically complex to set up, but again, it doesn't have to be overly complex for a small business, but it does require somebody who's going to run the system. It requires somebody who's going to manage and monitor the system. All of those things are necessary.
Absolutely. So if you've been with us, and by the way, Mike, I forgot to tell you at the start of this episode, this is episode number 80.
Nice.
We are edging ever
Wow.
closer to the century mark. But if you've been with us for 80 episodes, you know the drill by now that we do three questions, or in this case, six questions based on the topic. And then we like to close it out with a little bit of a lighthearted, fun take on it because these things can be a little bit dry. And Mike always has a knack for taking a silly question that sometimes tries to stump him and be not related to anything at all, and making it relevant. And since in the intro we mentioned the golden ticket, I tried to come up with a Willy Wonka based silly question, couldn't think of anything. So we're just going to go back to our trusty vault of silly question topics. Superheroes. If role-based access control were a superhero, what would its superpower be? And what would be the name of its archenemy?
Ooh. Hmm. Hmm. I mean, I guess it would have to be like Professor Xavier because Professor Xavier knows exactly where to place all of his students in the academy, right? So you've got the environment, you've got Professor Xavier, and he really is the security model for that school, knowing how to help the students develop their powers and sort of work within their defined job roles and talents. Obviously the enemy would be Magneto because Magneto wants to come in there and, break down the barriers, be the bad guy, and just generally, allow for chaos to ensue. And having magnetic forces, that can break down walls in terms of role-based access control. I mean, the guy's kind of a hacker, right? I mean, he just goes in there and disrupts everything and causes chaos, and he's just a not really good dude. So, yeah, I mean, I think Professor Xavier is very much like the security model for the Marvel world. Using his powers to add control and structure where there is none.
Plus, I think Professor Xavier can use his mind powers to uh, definitely protect the sensitive information and definitely control that access. Uh,
Absolutely.
And that wraps up another great episode of Mission Compliance. We hope our discussion today has provided you with valuable insights, practical strategies, and inspiration to navigate the ever evolving world of defense. We'd like to thank Mike for joining us and talking to us about the very important topic of role based access control. And by the time this episode comes out, be sure to go over to our YouTube channel and check out the video that Mike recorded on this very same topic. Thanks, Mike.
Hey, always a pleasure, Roman.
But the conversation doesn't end here. We encourage you to continue exploring these topics and connect with us via our social media channels. Share your thoughts, ask questions, and engage with fellow listeners using the hashtag Mission Compliance Podcast. And if they haven't already, what should they do, Mike?
Well, they should definitely like. Most importantly, they should subscribe. This podcast is really picking up steam. 80 episodes in. You guys were just having the time of our lives over here talking about compliance. You should be too, and definitely tell your friends about it.
And if you happen to be watching this episode on YouTube right now, good news is you're already in the right place to check out that role-based access control video. So go ahead and do that. But like Mike said, we'd appreciate it if you could like and subscribe to the channel. Also, rate and review the show because your feedback helps us to continue to bring you thought-provoking episodes and high-quality content. Join us next time as we delve further into the dynamic world of defense, security, and industry innovation. Until then, take care, stay informed, and make compliance your mission. See you next time.
Thanks, everybody.